If you have your scriptures, so please take and turn to the book of Exodus, chapter 14. We've been going through the book of Exodus this summer, so I hope you've been doing your homework each week. And so we're going to look at the story of the Red Sea. So we're going to be reading Exodus 14, verses 10 through 18. Hear now the word of the Lord. As Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up, and there were the Egyptians marching after them. They were terrified and cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, 'Leave us alone. Let us serve the Egyptians'? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert." Moses answered the people, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." Then the Lord said to Moses, "Why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to move on. Raise your staff, stretch out your hand over the sea to divide the water so the Israelites can go through the sea on dry ground. I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians so that they will go in after them, and I will gain glory through Pharaoh and all of his army, through his chariots and his horsemen. The Egyptians will know that I am the Lord when I gain glory through Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen." The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. Amen. All right, how many of y'all remember when you were younger and you played baseball? And you would start to run to third base, and you take off running, and then you look up, and then the third baseman has that ball, and he's waiting on you. And so you stop, and you say, "Oh no," and you turn back, and you start running back to second base, and then all of a sudden, he throws the ball, and the second baseman has the ball, and you say, "Oh no." And so you turn and you run back to third base, and they throw the ball, and it goes back and forth, back and forth. I don't know what y'all called that. We called it being in a pickle. And so you're in a pickle because you had nowhere to go. If you went to third base, he tagged you out. If you went to second base, he tagged you out. And then your thought is, what do I do? Do I just run to a certain base, pick a base, and run as fast as I can? Do I sit there and just fall down in the middle and just cry and say, "I give up"? Do I think, who in the world told me to run to third base? I could have stayed on second and been just fine. Would have been wonderful. But what do you do when you're stuck in that pickle? I don't know if you've ever been in one, but a pickle's a hard place to be. You can call it what you want, a tight spot, a predicament. It's those things where you're not quite sure if there's a way out, and you're stuck. And you wonder how you got there. Sometimes you get there because you made poor choices. Sometimes you get there because you were meant to be there. And it's often the pickle when you learn some of the greatest lessons. I will tell you, it's a scary place to be, and it will really test your faith. But when God pulls you through it, you stand amazed, and you give him the glory. Israel is about to be in a pickle. Remember, in the book of Exodus, God has done such great things. They were slaves for a long time. God shows up through Moses and said, "I will set these people free." And so Pharaoh refuses to let them go, but remember, God sent 10 powerful plagues, with the last plague being the mightiest, the Passover, the death of the firstborn. It was a plague where the people got to see not only God's wrath and his judgment and his power, but they got to see his grace. Because though they were guilty, he said, "If you will sacrifice this lamb and you put the blood on the doorpost, I will pass over and you will be delivered. You will be saved." And that night, remember, we said it was kind of cruel to say this way, but every house either had a dead son or a dead lamb. And after that happened, Pharaoh said, leave, go, get out. And we're talking about a number of about 2 million people, 2 million slaves, men, women, and children, left Egypt. And Pharaoh said, be gone. Now, we're going to talk about what happens at the Red Sea, but before we tackle that story, there's some things I want to kind of go through that I think are worth mentioning. First of all, we are often so hard on these Israelites and say, what a bunch of kids. Why didn't they have faith? Why couldn't they believe? But do y'all realize how long they were in Egypt? Exodus 12 says they were in Egypt 430 years. Okay? Can you get that? 430 years. Just for a comparison's sake, y'all remember when the Pilgrims landed on Plymouth Rock? 1620. Okay? So that means if you are a descendant of the Pilgrims, the Hebrews were in Egypt longer than you've been in America. And think about how ingrained this American culture is in you. That's how long they were in Egypt. Egypt was in them. Egypt was where they lived, how they breathed. And not just Egypt, but remember, they were slaves in Egypt. What they knew as their existence was pain, was misery, was sorrow, was fear. Fear of Pharaoh, fear of the Egyptian army, fear of this mighty power that held them in check. And so it's hard when that's what you've known to all of a sudden take a switch and flip on faith. As one commentator said, I think he said it best. He said it took one night to get the Hebrews out of Egypt, but it took 40 years to get Egypt out of the Hebrews. Because that was their existence. And I thought a way to explain this, and I had a friend, his name was also Barry, cool guy, great name, but he would have lots of foster kids come through his home. And he'd, one after the other, that was his ministry. He would minister to foster kids. And he came to a church that I served one time and spoke about being a foster parent. And one of the things he said that people don't realize is that they think that you can take a kid who's been in an awful situation, pick them up from this house, put them in a brand new house with a loving family, and then all of a sudden everything's fixed. And he said that's not how it works. Because even though they've changed houses, their mindset is still over here. And it takes a long time to get this child to realize they're no longer in Egypt. They're free. And so when you read the story of these Hebrews going through the wilderness, don't say, well, that's not what I would have done. Yeah, but if you've been in Egypt for 430 years, it took you a while. Second thing, and I love this, God knew where they were in their hearts and what they were ready for and what they were not. Okay, look at Exodus 13, verse 17. It says, when Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them on the road to the Philistine country, though that was shorter. For God said if they faced war, they might change their minds and return to Egypt. So God led the people around by the desert road toward the Red Sea, and the Israelites went up out of Egypt armed for battle. Now, to me, this is one of those passages where I just kind of chuckle at, because these slaves they're armed for battle, they're ready to go fight, and God says, y'all aren't ready for that yet. y'all can't handle that yet. God knew that if they went and saw the Philistine army, their knees would buckle, they would cower. Because even though Egypt is the greatest military, political force in the world, and they just fled Egypt, God did all these wonders, they did not fight one battle. Remember, God did everything. Every plague, every time they left, it was God's doing. Now, in the future, when they get to like the book of Joshua, God's going to say, okay, it's time for you to partner with me. It's time for you to fight, and I will be with you. But right now, I'm doing everything. And so they had never actually fought a battle. And God knew they weren't ready for this. So God knows what they're ready for and what they're not. Now, I want to clarify something here, because often when we say that, the first thing people think about is, does that mean God will never give us more than we can handle? I mean, we've all heard that phrase, but first of all, that's not biblical. Second, it assumes that God is the cause of every bad situation you're in. That's not the case. There are times when God does bring us to a place where we're in a pickle because he wants us there, but there are other times we're in a pickle because we make bad choices, or somebody else makes a bad choice. But the idea that God will never give us more than we can handle, that actually comes from 1 Corinthians chapter 10. And y'all, it's not talking about trials. It says that God will never allow us to be tempted beyond what we can bear. In other words, he's talking about temptation, not trials. But here's the promise God gives, is no matter what you go through, whatever pickle you're going through, he is faithful, and he will be with us. And he will see you through, okay? Now, I want y'all to think about that. In your mind, circle that word through, okay? Because that's important. Third thing is, and this is kind of one we're not going to talk much about, but it's wonderful. We can do the whole sermon series on this. They are going forward, but yet they're still grounded in the past. And I love this. Exodus 13:19. Moses took the bones of Joseph with him because Joseph had made the sons of Israel swear an oath. He had said, God will surely come to your aid, and then you must carry my bones up with you from this place. They're new, they're freedom, they're setting out to a new place. But yet someone had the audacity to believe that God was faithful to keep his promise. I love that. Joseph was the link to the patriarchs. He was the link to the promise, the past. And I think about this. For 430 years they were in Egypt, meaning somebody had to keep that promise going. Someone had to keep that hope there, saying God will fulfill his promise. You will not always be a slave. One day, God will take us home. Do you have the courage to believe that? And someone said, yes. And they kept the bones of Joseph. And I love this because I think of the Exodus that night. They're starting to leave. And they're like, does everybody got everything? Okay, first of all, did y'all use the restroom before we go? We're not turning around. Do you have the drinks? Yes. Do you have the bread? Got it. What do you got? I got the bones. But they're carrying those bones. Now, they're not going to be tied to the past where they're chained by it. But this was the promise God had made. And even though it took 430 years, God was faithful to that promise. They never gave up hope. And that's an important lesson for us. Never lose that hope. So, here, they're fixing to leave Egypt. God is directing them through this pickle, and he has a reason for doing it. Look at chapter 14, verse 4. He says, and I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will pursue them. But I will gain glory for myself through Pharaoh and all of his army, and the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord. So the Israelites did this. I love this because this is about God. So he says, I will harden. You thought the story was over. Pharaoh said go, but Pharaoh has a hard heart. And so here's what happens in the story. The Egyptians are watching the Israelites as they march out. And God has them not going straight there. Instead, they march like this. Then they march backwards. Then they march forwards. Then they march sideways. And Pharaoh and his generals are looking saying, what in the world? They're lost. What are they doing? And they're probably thinking, how in the world did we lose to these clowns? And they say, you know, these are our servants. If we're letting our slaves go, we'll be the laughing stock. And so they said, let's go get them. And so they decide they're going to go out and do this. And he sends, get this, 600 chariots. Now, y'all, that may not sound like much to y'all right now, but chariots was the top weapon of that day. That was the nuclear bomb of its time. That would be like if we went out after a bunch of folks and said, we're sending 600 nuclear bombs after them. You'd say that's overkill for a group of slaves. But they went after him. And Pharaoh's heart was so angry and so mad. But why is God allowing this? And here's what I think. God had already defeated the gods of Egypt. But Egypt was still the greatest military power in the world. And so God's going to say, you put your trust in those chariots, watch what I do to them. You think your physical power, you think your strength is all that? Watch what I do to it. And I'm going to show you the power of who I am, and I will gain glory when you see that. So imagine, 2 million people walking. God purposely has them brought to the Red Sea, to where there's a big body of water. And then all of a sudden, you hear the and you look up, clouds of dust, and there's this huge army. And you think, okay, what would the response of the Israelites be? God just did the plagues. God has delivered them. God has saved them. Would they have faith and trust? No, remember where they've been. And so look what their response is. Exodus 14, verse 10. As Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up, and there were the Egyptians marching after them, and they were terrified and cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us out to the desert to die? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, leave us alone, let us serve the Egyptians? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert. They're scared. That's their response. Why? Remember who Pharaoh is to these people. He is the ultimate villain. He is the bad guy. And yes, they've seen God at work, but Pharaoh is still Pharaoh. It's kind of like, I compared this morning to this. How many of y'all remember when you were a kid, the bully who picked on you? Okay? Now, if you can't remember being picked on as a bully, it probably meant you were the bully. Okay? But it's amazing that that bully was a long time ago, and even though you're bigger, stronger, better now, and you could take them, when you see that bully, the first response is your heart sinks. You're scared of them because your mind instantly goes back to that person, back then. And they see Pharaoh. And even though God's done all this stuff, they look and there's Pharaoh. He's after us. And so the first response, cry out to God. That was good. That's a good thing to do. Something bad goes on, you cry out to God. But what happens if God's fix-it plan doesn't happen like that? What do? Well, I'll tell you what people do when they're afraid. They blame somebody. And who do they blame? Moses. And I laugh every time I read this. I'm thinking, they always go after the preacher. But here's the thing, a lesson for us to learn is that at times, when people are scared, they got to lash out at somebody. They got to go after somebody. And oftentimes, if you're in a leadership role or if you're in a position where you represent God, they will be mad at you because they're upset at God. And so sometimes you just got to take it. You got to just let them do it because you know where the place where they're coming from is a place of fear. And so they go after and they blame Moses and they distort the facts. They say, we were better off in Egypt. You were slaves. We told you to leave us alone. No, you were grateful when God showed up and you said, praised him and worshiped him. And they're like, you should have let us alone because now we're going to die. Now, how would Moses respond to that? Let me ask, how would you respond to that? Would you say, you little ungrateful people, look what we've done. Do you not remember the 10 plagues? Do you remember what God did for you? And let's not forget, in this march to the Red Sea, God is present with them in a cloud of fire and a cloud there, pillar of cloud. So God's right there. Moses could have just went, hello? He's there. But look what Moses does. And I love his response. Verse 13. Moses answered the people, do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still. Moses is not afraid, but notice Moses. Now, as we get further on in Exodus, Moses will have some temper tantrums with folks. But right here, Moses says, guys, do not be afraid. And I love that response. Do not be afraid. Y'all know that that's the most repeated command in Scripture. He calms their fears. And then he says, stand firm. That means you place your feet in the ground. And even though you're scared, you say, I am not going to give up on this. I'm not going to move. You stand. And he says, see what God will do. You open your eyes and say, God, how are you going to get me out of this pickle? God, what are you going to do? And then he says, and be still. Now, we always look at that and that phrase, and we're thinking like Psalm 46 where it says, be still and know that I'm God. And we're thinking of a little tranquil thing and like a little calm deer just, be still. But that's not what Moses is saying here. In the Hebrew, basically what it means, and in a kind of a crash way, he's basically saying, be quiet or shut up. Stop it. Stop your griping. Stop your complaining. Calm down. Just stop. It's kind of like this. Remember that pickle imagery? It's where we're in a pickle, and you're running, you're frantically, and like, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? What am I going to do? And you're panicking. And the coach is saying, stop, calm down, stop. Look here. Look at me. Look at me. When I say go, you go. Be still. Trust me. I know he's got the ball. I know they got you in a pickle. But look at me. Listen. And trust. And when I say run, you run. That's how you get out of the pickle. And that's what Moses says. He says, do not be afraid. Watch what God's going to do here. But you just got to trust him. Be still. And watch how God delivers you. But then something happens next that is one of those difficult passages where absent from the theology of the cross and everything else, it doesn't make very much sense. Because next verse, in verse 15, it says this. Then the Lord said to Moses, why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to move on. And you're like, wait a minute. The Israelites were the ones whining. Moses was the one who had the faith. But why is God telling Moses to stop crying? Now, some say that because, maybe Moses, it's just not in the text, that he was crying out to God, and God said, Moses, be quiet. I think there's more to it. See, we learn further on that Moses represents the people to God. Moses is the mediator between a holy and righteous God and a sinful people. And so these people cannot go straight to God. And so Moses stands in that gap. So when God looks through these people, he sees Moses. And when these people look at God, they go through Moses. He is the mediator, or what we would later call the high priest. He stands in that gap. In fact, we learn elsewhere in Exodus 32, when they do the golden calf, we'll get to that here in a few weeks, God's ready to kill everybody. And Moses says, they have messed up, they have sinned, but God, please forgive them. And if you are not willing to forgive them, blot my name out of the book of life. In other words, let me take their place. Let me bear their guilt. Take my name out and forgive them. Does that sound familiar? So God says to Moses, because he is the mediator for these people, why are you crying to me? Go forward. Trust me, just go. Now remember, There's a sea. How much faith that would take. But something happens. The God who is leading them goes behind them and puts a barrier between them and the Egyptians, between that which would harm them and that where there's deliverance is. And then Moses obediently raises his staff. And y'all, we picture this in our mind, and I hope you have this grand thing. This is not a puddle going. This is a huge body of water. And a howling wind comes, and the wind separates the walls. And they walk on dry ground. So imagine, it's dark at night. You got the Egyptians behind you screaming, yelling, and all this. And then all of a sudden, the wind is whoosh, whoosh, like a tornado. And it's dark, and you're trying to walk through this body of water. Hundreds of feet of water on each side. I'm sure there were some, no problem, walking right through. Others are probably like, is it going to come down? Is it going to come down? And they were walking slowly. But all were equally saved because it was God who was doing it. There's so much more to say about this, but y'all, then Pharaoh, after they get through, he says, well, if they can do it, I can do it. And they go through, and one of the things I love is that God causes chaos in the Egyptian army. And I love these powerful chariots. It says that he broke the wheels. And the wheels is all those powerful things, all those things you place your faith in, just like that, they're gone. And then the water collapses, and the battle's over. And look at the impact it had. Verse 30. That day, the Lord saved Israel from the hands of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians lying dead on the shore. And when the Israelites saw the great power the Lord displayed against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord. They put their trust in him and in Moses, his servant. God got the glory, and the people trusted in him. Real quick, what does this mean for us? Well, the first one you see is this, is that sometimes it often takes a pickle for us to learn to trust God and to break old sinful ways. Sometimes the best way for you to learn about God is when you have nowhere else to turn but up. And that's when you understand the greatness and power and the deliverance of God. Second thing, no matter what you're going through, God is always faithful, and he will see you through. They didn't go around the Red Sea. They went through it. God will see you through. Just remember, one of our favorite things we love to read all the time, Psalm 23. And whenever you go through Psalm 23, you got to go back to old King James. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. When I walk through the valley of the when I go through the valley, thou art with me. I'm not afraid. Why? Because God's with me. Now, I don't know what you're going through. I don't know what trials or tribulations you're going through right now, but I can guarantee you this. God is with you. And he will see you through. Be still. Trust in him. Listen, obey, follow, and trust. But a third thing I want you to see here is that this is not really about the Israelites. This is about God. This is about God. And I love this. In Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 7, it says this: the Lord did not set his affections on you and chose you because you were more numerous than other peoples, for you were the fewest of all people. In other words, Israel, God didn't choose you because you were so pretty or because you were so good. But he says, but it was because the Lord loved you and kept an oath he swore to your forefathers that he brought you out of the mighty hand and redeemed you from the land of slavery, from the power of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Know therefore that the Lord your God is God. He is a faithful God, keeping his covenant of love to 1,000 generations of those who love him and keep his commandments. We often read this story and think, yes, I'm facing the Red Sea. I'm going to make it through. That's a good lesson to learn. But that's not the lesson that God's trying to teach us. The lesson God's trying to teach us is, I have got you through, and I will get you through again. Look to me. Because remember, it says, you will know that your God is the Lord. And he keeps his promise. He is faithful. And that brings us to the last and greatest pickle. And that pickle was, how does a holy and righteous, loving God deal with the sin of his people? A God who is holy, who is righteous, who would look at the wrong and the mistakes and the doubts and the fears and all the things that we have, like the Israelites had against God. And how would he judge that sin? But you be faithful to his people and faithful to his promise, to his covenant. If only we had a mediator. If we had someone who would stand in the gap and say, God, they've messed up, but I represent them. Place their sins on me. Place their guilt, place their shame on me. And let the water crash down on me. Let me pay their penalty. Let me pay their price. Because like the Hebrew says, we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who is tempted in every way like we are. But he went into the holy temple and made sacrifice for us. And God laid on him all of our sins.